But, you know,
Can you hear me?
I'm a little worried about doing
If I'm not even in the camera?
You
should pick it up. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our forum this afternoon. My name is Ann Luther. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters Downeast, one of the sponsors of this morning's event. I will in a moment introduce our guest, Donna Loring, but for those of you who are on Zoom, I have just a few little tips. We are recording this event, and I'm going to ask you all on Zoom to keep yourselves muted for the entire duration of the conversation. If you want to make sure you're getting the best view of Donna, you can switch to speaker view on your Zoom format. We're going to use the chat for people on Zoom to offer questions. Please don't use the chat for any background chatter, but if you have a question for Donna, type it into the chat and we'll make sure it gets asked once her remarks are finished. So with that, let me introduce Donna. Donna is an elder and formal council member of the Penobscot Indian Nation. She held the position of the nation's representative to the Maine State Legislature for 12 years. In March of 2009, Donna donated her legislative and personal papers to the Maine Women's Writers Collection at the University of New England, where they have been categorized and made available to the public and to scholars for research. Donna served as a member of the Women's Army Corps in Vietnam from 1967 to 1968. She is a former senior advisor on tribal affairs to Governor Janet Mills. She hosts a radio station on our favorite community radio channel, WERU, in Orland, Maine. When does that broadcast, Donna?
It broadcasts the fourth Tuesday. I mean, yeah, every month, like the fourth week. It's on a Tuesday from 4 to 5.
For the 4 o'clock slot, that's the slot we have too. On May 13th, 2017, she was awarded an honorary doctorate degree in humane letters by the University of Maine at Orono. In May of 2022, she received an honorary doctorate degree in humane letters from Thomas College in Waterville, Maine. And above all of this, she has a lecture series endowed in her honor. The next, let me see if I can get the right title here. The annual lecture series addresses current or historic Native American rights or Aboriginal issues, Indigenous rights, as well as women's issues, civil rights, and issues of fairness and equality as they overlap with the concerns of tribal people. The upcoming one is on October 5th, 2023 at 12 p.m., a reading by Morgan Talty, author of Night of the Living Res, in case you want to look that up and tune into that. So with those remarks, I'm very pleased to have Donna here to talk about the tribe's perspective on question 3. Thank you for joining us, Donna.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I understand it's a question that is unclear to a lot of people. I'm going to try to make it a bit clearer, particularly so that you understand the tribal perspective on it. So in all of my talks, even on my radio shows, I always lay some groundwork and background before I get to the actual meat of the question. So the groundwork that I'd like to lay for this question, I entitle Slaves, Indians, and the Maine Constitution. So I'm not going to pull any punches, and I'm not going to apologize for anything that I say. I've done quite a bit of research, and these are my personal perspectives. I'll put that out to you right now. So Maine owes its statehood to slaves and Indians. The state has never seen the Indians as first-class citizens. And we've been treated as foreigners in our own land. Now, when you talk about land, you talk about the importance of what it is. And what it is it's a resource, and it's a step for power and wealth. because you can't build a house. You can't create any wealth without land. Got to have that. So, and when the colonists came to this country, they needed land. And who had the land? The Indians had the land. So I have a series, one series on my show. It's on tribal sovereignty. And the first show that I have on tribal sovereignty, I have the author, Colin Calloway, on one of my first shows. And he wrote a book entitled The Indian World of George Washington, which sort of intrigued me because, you know, when you think of George Washington, you don't think of Indians. You know, you think of the founding father of this country. So in speaking with Colin, he was on my show, you know, he basically said, you know, George Washington had to deal with the Indians because he wanted the land. And what he did was he was very taken up in surveying. That was his big hobby. He surveyed millions of acres of land because to him, land was key to the nation that he wanted to build. And in order to build that nation, had to have the land. And they really didn't have a lot of resources to get into wars with the Indians. So there were other ways that they proceeded to get the land. And through treaty, the colonists made agreements, all kinds of ways to get land. So with that piece, that George Washington piece about how important the land was, and when Washington, let me just say that it was so important, then when Washington became president, one of the things that happened was the 1790 Non-Intercourse Act. And that act, because they wanted to expand, they didn't want people and states to start buying land because they wanted to build this nation, and they wanted it to be a federal effort. And they didn't want little pieces all, you know, being owned by various states, various individuals. So they wanted to keep that avenue for the federal government. And this 1790 Non-Intercourse Act basically said that only the federal government could treaty with the Indians, not states, not individuals. So remember that 1790, 6 years after 1790, in 1796, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts enters a treaty with the Penobscot Nation to take land. And that treaty actually was the basis for further treaties, the Treaty of 1818 and then 1820. And it's basically the foundation for the Penobscots owning these well, solidifying their ownership, we'll put it that way, to the islands and the river and where they live now. And also, I believe at that time there were 4 townships that was important to the Penobscot Nation for their hunting and their survival, basically. So they wanted to solidify that ownership, and they wanted the federal government to recognize that ownership. So in 1820, when Maine wants to become a state, there's a couple things happening. And one of those things is the issue of owning slaves. And when you think about slaves, you think about the big ships that brought them over. And also, you know, they also took native people too as slaves in these ships. So the agreement was that the state of Maine would come in, as you know, it's the Missouri Compromise. State of Maine would come in as a free state, and Missouri would be a slave state. There was some banter at the time that you know, what's the difference? Why aren't you a slave state too? Because look at how you're treating the Indians. But they sort of just let that pass. And Maine did become a state in March of 1820. But in the meantime, when they were getting their statehood, of course, they had to negotiate with Massachusetts because, you know, they were part of Massachusetts and they wanted to separate. So then there were articles of separation. So this is a little bit where this comes in, this Constitution piece comes in. So with the articles of separation, Massachusetts kind of said, well, you know, we're making some money here on Maine land. They had a lottery, they were selling Maine land. And so we're in a position where we can lose a lot of money. And so they thought, well, okay, let's make an agreement with this new state of Maine, and we'll divide up the lands. We'll take 2/3 of, you know, these lands that are in question. I guess and Maine can have the 1/3, and that's what these articles of separation are talking about, is the ownership of these lands. But then Massachusetts also had treaties with the Indians. So they didn't want to be stuck with paying off the Indians, you know, year after year for these treaties. So they wanted Maine to take that over. And as part of this separation, Maine agreed to do that. So that's the articles of separation, sort of in a nutshell. And so this 1820 treaty was looked at, Maine becomes a state, 1820. These articles of separation were attached to the Maine Constitution, because Maine had to have a constitution in order to become a state. That was a part of what they had to do in the federal government's eyes to become a state. So Maine asked the tribes, asked Penobscot Nation to enter a treaty, and they took that treaty that had already been agreed to by Massachusetts. There was already agreement between Penobscot, Massachusetts, 1818. So they took that treaty basically verbatim, and they asked Penobscot to negotiate again that treaty, and they would take over the responsibility that Massachusetts had for the tribes. And the tribes looked at this treaty, because here they are. I mean, there's probably in Penobscot, there's probably about 250 tribal members left. And, you know, there's like, I don't know, 19 to 20,000 non-natives. So they looked at this treaty as being a way for their lands that they had in treaty to be secure. Maine agreed that they would keep these lands. So the tribes looked at this as a sovereign to sovereign agreement, a treaty, that we get to keep what land we have left, the islands and the river and the 4 townships. And so they looked at it as that kind of a guarantee for future lands and to keep their resources. Maine looked at the agreement in a different way. Maine looked at it like, well, let's just say they looked at it as a surrender document. They didn't really look at it as an agreement between sovereigns, or they just looked at it like, okay, we'll take over what Massachusetts said that they would do, but you will become our wards, just like you were under Massachusetts. So the tribe sort of didn't see that way. So this treaty, 1820 treaty, that was the beginning of much litigation to come. So there's an argument, I guess, that these treaties, even though they were made after 1790, that because Maine became a state, that meant that the Constitution, the federal government had proved that. So when doing it, they also approved this Articles of Separation. So, and a lot of it is like, Maine didn't, and Massachusetts wasn't really part of that 1790 thing, because that had to do with the Western tribes. So the response that we have to that is that in December of 1790, my good friend in prison, who is also on my radio show quite a bit, is Harold Prince, who's an anthropologist, expert in Indian history and affairs. And so Harold came across this letter, 1790 letter, written on the 29th of December to the Seneca chiefs of New York, because the Seneca chiefs were worried about these land deals. And it's quite a long letter, and you can find this on the internet if you look. And the piece that I want to pull out of that is this. And George Washington says this to the Seneca chiefs. Says, and I quote, "The general government only has the power to treat with the Indian nations, and any treaty formed and held without its authority will not be binding." So he says this after. So I'll just throw that out to you. So I want to say that at that time too, the South, with the slavery, their big deal was that, was the cotton. They needed the slaves for the cotton. In Maine had the lumber. So, and of course, the lumber was on Indian land, and they did things to get the land and the lumber. And by, I'm going to say, the 1840s, Bangor, Maine, because of the lumber industry, becomes one of the wealthiest cities in the world per capita because of this. And I think it's a mid 1850s or 60s, there are pictures in the Penobscot River of the logging. And these logs, they floated down the river, and they would be from bank to bank. I can almost guarantee you that no fish survived that. And there were like 250 sawmills on that river at one time. So imagine the devastation that took place on what the tribes considered a place where they could get their food, the fish, medicines that grew along the sides of that river. And it just basically devastated them. So they saw this treaty as being a way to survive. You know, we'd at least have our lands that we can hunt on. And so they really depended on that. 1833, the state of Maine comes in because they want the lumber. The tribe has 4 townships. They want those townships. So they send in negotiators to the tribe to buy the townships. And make a long story short, the deal was done. They bought the townships for $50,000. The tribe said they didn't agree to it. There's a controversy over that to this day. But Maine stuck with the fact that they believed that the deal made was legal. So the tribes lost those townships. So when I say that the Indians in Maine have always been treated like second-class citizens and foreigners in their own country, if you can see this pretty well if you look at these constitutions. The first constitution, so in 18, you can look these up on the internet. So I have a copy of the 1825 Constitution. And in that Constitution, there's where it says under electors, Article 2, it says who can elect officials and representatives. So the Section 1, Article 2, Section 1, electors, every male citizen of the United States of the age of 21 years and upwards, excepting paupers, persons under guardianship, and Indians not taxed. Okay, this was 1825. This was the Constitution that they created. And what's important about a Constitution? Well, the Constitution outlines your government. It outlines your electors. It outlines how you're going to govern in just about every avenue, military, schools. So, that was important. So it left the Indians in Maine unable to vote. So they couldn't vote. They couldn't pick who they wanted to represent them. They were treated as foreigners, paupers. So that was the first thing that was left out of the first Constitution. And then when it came to figuring out the districts, you have to figure out how many, the census, you take the census. So there's a section in the Constitution under Article 4 that says how this is going to be done and what years. But it also says that the legislature, which shall first be convened under the Constitution, shall honor before the 15th day of August, 1821, and the legislature within every subsequent period of 10 years, and at least 5, cause the number of inhabitants of the state to be ascertained. Okay, so they're counting the population, exclusive of foreigners not naturalized and Indians not taxed. So the Indians were not even considered citizens. They weren't considered members of their districts. And Indians not taxed is a phrase that, if you're taxed, if you're pay your taxes, then you're allowed to have certain privileges within the state. Indians weren't taxed. And why would they be taxed? They owned their land to begin with, before, and they were considered separate nation. So it could be argued that Indians not taxed represents the fact that they were recognized as sovereigns. But it could also be argued that it was just used as an excuse to just keep them separate, keep them disadvantaged, and keep them poor. So that was the 1825 Constitution. The other thing is, over the years, and again, I mentioned that owning a house is very important to start your personal wealth. Indian people, because of the fact that their lands are in trust and protected, they're not allowed to sell. They're not allowed to sell those lands to non-Indians. So if they want to have money to build a house, they don't have land for collateral. Okay. So that was an issue for a long, long time. But Maine did, in the Constitution, give the tribes access to the Maine Housing Authority that would allow them to get loans to build houses. That was done. That was a constitutional change that had to be voted on by the entire state of Maine. So have you all had to have your privileges to buy a house voted on by the whole state? So I mean, that's just one of the examples, which I think is pretty clear. But I also want to mention that 100 years later, in 1942, we have World War II. And during World War II, state decides that they want to streamline government. And they want to take a close look at what's going on in government. Are they spending their money right? So what they do is they have a whole list, and Indians were not the only item on this list. There were others, but the Indians were on the list because of the treaty obligations that the state agreed to become a state. So this committee got together, and the reason I know about this, and I don't know if you listen to my radio show, but the reason I know about it is because I was researching for a second book and came across transcripts of the 1942 Legislative Committee. And there were transcripts of the Director of Health and Human Services, Welfare at the time, Health and Welfare, and of Frank Cowan, who was the Attorney General at the time, and Ralph Proctor, who was hired to do research. So they were transcripts verbatim of these people's testimony. And if you want to hear their testimony, listen to my radio shows. So one of the things that they talked about was the obligation under these treaties, because they really didn't understand why are we paying these Indians this money every month, every year. I think it added up to over 100,000 per tribe. So, and why is that? How did that happen? Can we cut this expense down? And how do we do that? Well, to make a long story short, what they figured out they were going to do they had a couple of ways to do it. One was they were thinking of, and it was a bill that was in front of them, was to have because they felt that they could control the Indians. They owned everything. They could take anything they wanted. And they could define who an Indian was. So in doing that, they thought, well, okay, so why don't we require that these Indian tribal members be quarter blood.
Be what?
Quarter blood.
Okay.
They have at least one quarter blood before they can be Indian, or we can consider them Indian. And also, if an Indian woman marries a white man, then she loses her membership in the tribe, and her children lose their membership, and she also loses her property. This was an actual bill before the state legislature. So they took that bill as a tool. They say, okay, we'll work this bill because it's the beginning of something. We can expand on it. So, and then they had the committee and they talked to these representatives of different departments to get their ideas and to understand further the situation. So the results of those interviews, I call them the testimony, was a report that's referred to as the 1942 Proctor Report by Ralph Proctor, who was the superintendent at the, I think it was a school in Augusta area. I forget the name of the school right now. But they hired him to do research and create a report. But in these committee hearings, it wasn't all that far from this slavery and Indian sort of idea that Indians were like slaves. So in the one of the transcripts, it's a McDonald transcript. And it's page 34 of that transcript. This guy, one of the representatives named Payson, he was from Portland. And he says this, and I quote, "This is what we need to do, because this problem, it seems to me, is a real problem. It is a miniature slave problem. You gave the slaves in the South emancipation, made them all free men, but you didn't solve anything so far as the economic problem was concerned. We have got a miniature slave problem here. And it seems to me we need to be careful in working it out. Not by the legislature, but by people who know how to work people out of bad proposition as a social proposition." So, it was a problem. And the problem was that they had to pay money to these Indians. And these Indians were actually multiplying. And how do we stop that from happening? And one of the ideas was, well, why don't we just disperse them into the next town? And the answer to that was, well, the next town wouldn't appreciate that. They don't have the money to take care of Indians, and they don't get along with Indians anyway, so that wouldn't work. So, it's from this sort of paradigm, this way of looking at Indians, that is filtered into the Constitution of the state of Maine, and the dealings with the tribes that, they're not really, they're more like slaves than they are citizens. So and another thing. So in 1875, they decide that, okay, so we don't like the fact that this is in the Constitution, that we owe this treaty obligation to the tribes. But then, there are other things in this Constitution that no longer apply. So why don't we, because they were given this power to do this in 1821, that they could review the Constitution and make changes, and of course they'd have to put it out to vote. So they had a committee in 1875 to look at changing some of the things that were out of date, and that wasn't working. So 1875, they decide, the result of that committee review was to redact the language that the treaty obligations to the Indians. The problem was that it was an agreement between Massachusetts and Maine. And they had to have that in their Constitution because that was the articles that allowed them to separate from Massachusetts. So in the Constitution, the wording, if I can find it, the wording in the Constitution says, I can't find it, I'll just, yeah. So under section 5 of that article, the Constitution, where it says the Constitution be arranged by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. They review it and then they make changes. One of the things that it says is that Constitution as amended upon appropriate titles and proper articles, parts, and sections, omitting all sections, clauses, and words not in force. Okay, so they could, when they make changes, they can take anything that's not in force out. Okay, that's pretty simple. However, the Articles of Separation was still in force. So they couldn't take that out, but they still didn't want it out there for people to look at. So this is what they do, which I think is, pretty smart. So they say section 7. This is Article 10, section 7. Okay, original sections 1, 2, 5 of Article 10 not to be printed. Section 5 in full force. That's the treaty obligations. Shall hereafter be omitted in any printed copies thereof prefixed to the laws of the state. But this shall not impair the validity of acts under those sections. And said section 5 shall remain in full force as part of the Constitution, according to the stipulations of said section, with the same effect as if contained in said printed copy. So, even though it's invisible and you can't read it, it's in full effect. So, just tell me what state in this country has a constitution that if you can't read it, the invisible part of it's still in effect, in full effect. How ridiculous is that? So, when I first found out about this, that was my thought. It's pretty clear that, it's part of the Constitution. Well, it should be printed. People need to read the Constitution. They need to understand the laws that govern their own state. And not picking and choosing, like, we don't like this one, so we're gonna put that in the margin. And when teachers teach state law and they teach the Constitution, well, sorry, but this section here, it's in full effect, but you have to specifically ask the state archives to actually read it. Now, you know, the Attorney General of the state of Maine has said this needs to be printed. Secretary of State has said this needs to be printed. The only person who says that it shouldn't be printed, that it should just be left outside, is the chief executive.
Oh, of course.
They can't really articulate. They can say, well, it's going to confuse people. Well, you know what? I'm more confused now trying to find something that's invisible in my Constitution. So that argument doesn't hold water as far as I'm concerned.
Is there any other organization that's opposed to it? I can't imagine. Anybody?
You know, I don't know. I haven't heard. I think this is a more or less a bipartisan issue,
Yeah.
that this language should be put readable in the Constitution. So I want to go back to 1875 though, because it's very, I came across, and I was doing some research, I came across this, which I thought was pretty interesting. It was the minutes of the 1875 Constitution where they redacted this. And what I was looking for was some kind of reason why they redacted it, but they don't have that here. They just had the motions and the, you know, and the votes. They don't go into detail. But I found this really telling, where I'm gonna read it to you. They put in say on the assembling of the commission, and this is 1875. Yesterday, Judge Kent, the president taking chair, made the following address. So the chair of this Journal of Constitutional Commission, 1875, addresses the commission. And he says this is, I just want you to sort of understand the mindset that was happening there in 1875. Our, quote, ship of state, unquote, gentlemen, after tossing on the political waters for more than half a century, has been brought into port by here present officers for examination and repairs. To the casual observer, the good old ship appears wonderfully staunch, strong, and seaworthy, but has been surmised and asserted that after this more than 100 years of service, there may be found here and there a slight leak, now and then a decayed timber, and more or less a strain of weakened spars. Spars, what spars? I had to look that up, and it's the pole that holds the mast in place. And we, gentlemen, have been summoned as a council of preliminary survey with instructions to search our defects, patent and Latin, and to suggest remedies by ways of amendments of what we find defective, support of what is weakened, and the stoppage of such threatening leaks, which may eventually sink the ship. We are not asked or expected to remodel entirely the vessel, or to attempt the building of a new one from the keel. Our duty, as I understand it, will be performed when we have done our best to ascertain and point out to the owners what we deem needful to fit our noble ship. To again unfurl her sails and hoist again the stars and stripes, and put boldly to sea for another successful voyage for the coming century. So there's a lot more of that. But you get the drift.
Who was the gentleman?
The gentleman was Judge Kent. Yeah. So it was that kind of mindset. I mean, they're working on the Constitution. And we have a ship captain or whatever, who's the chair. Do you think that Indian rights or Indian considerations or obligations meant anything to these guys? I would say no. But luckily, it's a new day. Today, in 2023, I'm hoping that the thoughts and the way that people understand each other now has changed. I know the governor has often said that the high tide rises all ships or whatever, but you got to have a ship. We don't have ships. We never did. And that symbolism, the ship symbolism, doesn't work for everybody.
I have a question here that might be somewhat relevant to.
Really?
Yeah.
Be careful.
Okay, well, it's kind of a stretch, but
Yeah.
the question is, in the 1823 Johnson v. McIntosh ruling, which I
Yes.
don't know what that is, which says that the tribes only have a right to occupy. The
Mhm.
question is, do the tribes have title to their land?
No.
Or only the right to occupy their
Only
land?
the right to occupy.
Still.
That's today. That is still. Yep.
As individuals or as tribes?
As tribes. If you're a tribal member and you're in a tribal community, all tribal land is you can't sell it. You cannot sell that to a non-tribal member. These are all protections that were put in place because they were unscrupulous people and governments who wanted to get land away from the tribes. But because of these protections, the tribes, they have protections where they get to keep the land that they have. But it has unintended consequences, I guess, and one of them is that they can't use that land for collateral. Because the different societies, different cultures, we don't tribal communities, we don't tax each other. We just don't. We have a very different way of looking at life and living. So I do want to, because the question was, I mean, how should we vote on this resolution that the state has put out there? And I wrote something at the end here, if I can find it. All right, here we go. I'm a few minutes early. But
I'm sure we're gonna have questions.
okay, sure. So what I say is that, it's time to begin to fix this problem. It is not the Indian problem. It is a state problem. We begin by not hiding the state's obligations, but by shining light on them and honoring them. A treaty did exist, and it was agreed to. Put those obligations back into the Maine Constitution. It is the right and honorable thing to do.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Are there any other parts to the Constitution that are invisible like that?
Can I
Yes.
just, before you answer that,
Sure.
can I just check and on the Zoom, are you able to hear the question being asked, or do we need to repeat the question? Can anybody just type in the chat? They can hear. Okay. Repeat the question one more time and then we'll go ahead.
Are there any other invisible parts of the Maine Constitution? Is this the only one?
No, yes, there are more invisible parts. And those, where did I say they redacted? Oh, yeah. Sections 1, 2, 1 and 2 are redacted. Okay, they're taken out because they've fulfilled their obligations. There's no duties, I guess, to be done. And they redacted the 5th, but they were very careful to say it's still in effect.
So what happened to 3 and 4?
They remain,
They're still printed.
Oh,
Yeah.
they're not redacted.
Right.
right.
I have seen the governor.
Mhm, I have too.
Start a fight here, but I've seen the governor say that she does not believe that the redacted sections are still in force because she believes that those obligations were dispatched by the Settlement Act. I bet you're going to disagree with that.
Oh, yeah, definitely disagree with that. And I'm gonna, well, I got a few minutes.
Yeah. take your time.
Well, okay, so let's look at the treaties for one thing. When you go back to the 1796 treaty, the 1818, 1819, 1820, by the way, the 1820 treaty that was signed, negotiated, I guess, signed, was done after Maine became a state. It was done six months after Maine became a state. So, I mean, these treaties are, I think for a treaty to be enforceable, to be legal, a treaty has to be entered into by both sides that understand what that treaty is gonna mean. These treaties, first of all, there's a question of their legality at entering them after 1790, and I'm sure the chief executive would have an issue with that. But there is that question. And the fact that the land claims is also considered a treaty. These treaties, right from 1790 to present, particularly the land claims, and I'm going to zero in on land claim, that treaty or that settlement was, in my eyes, in my reasoning, fraudulent. And why I say that is because the original title to this was the Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act. They now call it the Maine Claims Act, not the land claims. The land claims, when you think of a land claims, you think, wow, it's a treaty that's gonna decide about land.
Mhm.
Well, this treaty ended up by giving exclusive jurisdiction in many areas to the state of Maine on criminal laws and other laws that affected the tribes. So court cases and whatever are totally affected. So it's not land. We're not just talking about land.
Right.
We're talking about state control. And the state, basically, I'm going to say that the land claim settlement was this a dream, the state's dream come true. Because what they really wanted ever since 1942, maybe even before that, was to have Indians become part of the state, just kind of disappear and assimilate. And under the land claims, they're treated as municipality, which is what they've always wanted. We don't have tribes in Maine, we have municipalities. We have political subdivisions. We totally disagree with that. And that's a big reason why Penobscot and Passamaquoddy, basically walked out of the State House because, you know, we had seats and Passamaquoddy came back. But Penobscot we have not returned. And we haven't returned because, first of all, we are not a political subdivision of the state of Maine.
Yeah.
And as far as, and again, I think that these Land Claim Settlement Act, the things that has in it, for instance, there's a phrase that in that claims that was added the last week before it went to the Congress, was that if there's any federal laws passed that affect Indians, they do not apply in Maine unless Maine says it's okay. And that would have to be specific. You would have to specifically name tribes in a law, Maine tribes, for that overall federal law to apply to Maine tribes. So, you know, this land claims, and I'm going to call it because it was supposed to be a land claims. It just kind of grew like a cancer and took over, you know, all the aspects of tribal government. And when you look at tribes across the country where their sovereignty is recognized by those states, there's growth there. They help each other. And of course, the ways of making money, one of them was the casino. Again, there's a big yes and no about that. But in many of those cases, these casino tribes have contributed to the state in general, the state coffers. So, you know, I just think that that land claims needs to be abrogated because it's what I consider the fruit of the poisonous tree. And Maine needs to just throw it out, sit down with the tribes, and start from a very truthful beginning and work out agreements. So,
Any more questions here? Rick?
Wasn't there just a very recent bill that was signed?
yes,
That granted one of the tribes?
yes, that was the Micmac tribe.
How does that work? You know, how does that fit into the sovereignty issue, I guess, the general sovereignty issue?
Yeah, I'm reluctant to speak about the Micmac. I mean, I don't represent the Micmac.
Okay.
That's all I will say about it.
Okay.
Anybody else?
I actually have another one.
Go ahead, Rick.
In terms of the you know, the invisible ink, has there been any legal cases that have been resolved or legal precedent or whatever that's been different because some of this is invisible versus not? I mean,
Well, it could be, but it's invisible.
right.
There could be,
Okay,
could very well be.
has there been?
You can't tell. Because, you know, if there's a court case and the judge, you know, pulls out the Constitution to look at it or whatever, and they don't see our piece in there, goes again. And, you know, judges, and, you know, know a little bit about judges. I've sit on judiciary for like 9 years. They don't know a heck of a lot of history between the Indians and the state. So, you know, I'm gonna say it's possible.
I have just one question, just slightly off topic, I guess, but I've noticed you've never used the word Wabanaki. Do you have a feeling about the
Well,
Wabanaki Federation versus?
I think the Wabanaki is great.
Okay,
And I use the word Indian because that's the legal term.
okay.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that I agree with it.
Legal
but
to
it's-
whom?
It's the legal to the state of Maine and to, yeah, because you have to speak in legalese because, you know, the lawyers and whatever, they all use those terms.
Don, under the question 3, or question 6, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Question 6, the redacted sections 1 and 2 would also be required to be printed, right?
You know, I am not sure. I have no feeling about those. If they want to print those, that's fine.
I mean, they could just assume
But-
repeal them, I guess, if they don't want to print them, but
I think that the fact that they redacted them, that they omitted them, meant that they were not in effect.
I mean, they were pretty temporal, you know, I kind of looked
Yeah,
at
like-
them and they
yeah.
had to do with Massachusetts and Maine
Right.
and the handover.
Right.
Yeah. Anybody else? Anybody online with a question? Oh, wait, there are questions here. Hold on. Here's one. How did the doctrine of discovery, papal bulls of 1493 play a role in these decisions? And how is that affecting the Wabanaki tribes?
Well, the papal bulls, I don't know if everybody knows.
No, we don't know.
What they are.
No.
Are you joking?
No, we don't know.
You don't know?
Please
Okay.
give us a little background here.
Okay. The papal bulls, I kind of look at those as sort of like an executive order from the Pope. And back in those times, when the church was taking land and resources and killing pagans, the Pope basically said that if you're a Christian country, then you can go into a pagan country, kill them, take the land, and it's okay.
We've got a lot to answer for. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so, and then if there's another Christian country involved, then you work that out between yourselves. But that's those edicts from various popes gave them, and they're basically the same. They perpetuated white supremacy. And it's like God has favored us and given us a divine destiny over everybody. We're white, we're better than you, and we're smarter than you. And therefore, we have more power. So that's what these papal bulls sort of started. And it's perpetuated down through the centuries.
It was a moral authority for genocide, basically.
Exactly.
It's horrifying.
Yes. Oh, and by the way, now that we're talking about genocide, even though these transcripts were in 1942, before the definition of genocide came out, I think it came out in 1947. That's what this is. when they talk about taking away tribal membership, when they talk about dispersing, they're talking about eliminating a whole race of people.
Yeah, not necessarily by killing them, but
Not
by not.
exactly good. And the genocide law,
What
takes that
happened
into account.
with the women who married white?
what happened to that law?
Yeah,
Okay.
Did that go away? I hope so.
So that the Legislative Research Committee amended that to include both men and women.
Hmm. That made it better.
So about 5 years later, the tribe finally said, no, we're
Oh, that's
not.
just-
So they changed that. The tribe changed that in their own census committee. They didn't allow it.
They didn't allow the marriage or
They didn't allow the law
Right,
to take
right.
effect.
Yeah, so the women are still members
Yes.
of the tribe.
Yes.
And their children,
and their
yeah.
Right.
children.
Yeah.
Oh,
But if you look at the 1942 Proctor report, there's a report, and there are pieces of this report that talk about white men marrying Indian women and their progeny, and white women marrying Indian men and their progeny, and illegitimates. So they keep track of these marriages and how many children from these marriages. And you think, why? What was the purpose of that? Well, the purpose was to keep count of how many. They wouldn't allow the count to happen in the census,
Right.
right.
but on the other hand, we need to know how many we are here because we're paying out for you guys.
Right.
So,
More questions? Anecdotes? I was doing something on suffrage a couple years ago, and the suffrage centennial, and our talk had a lot to do with how all women did not get the vote in 1920. It took a long time, and I came around to researching when Indians got the vote in Maine, and I read some of the legislative testimony over the argument about that, and so this would have been in the 1950s or 60s, and I'm looking around the room and thinking most of us were probably alive at that time, not you, Lane. But the language that was used in that discussion, it's going to make me cry right now. It was horrifying. And it was right there in the legislative record. Nobody was the least bit embarrassed about it. They were just saying, don't give them the vote, make them assimilate, stuff like that. It was not great.
So, I mean, the tribal communities were looked at as being segregated. And the best thing you could do with these segregated communities is disperse them, right? Get them up there.
Yeah.
We're doing them a favor.
Yeah.
And that was the paradigm. That was the thought.
I'll tell another story. So I worked in a trust accounting business,
I'm
taking-
sorry, can you turn your head a little?
Sure, I
this
worked
way?
in a trust accounting business previously, and it was about keeping track of people's securities and who owned which shares and who got which dividends and all that stuff. And at this time, there was the big, I don't know what, controversy all over the BIA money that was held in trust.
BIA,
Bureau of Indian Affairs.
is that national?
Mhm. Federal money, and it was gazillions of dollars. It was so much money. But over the generations, the record keeping had been so bad, like they weren't counting heads there, that nobody, no matter what computer, could figure out who was entitled to what. And it was, they were looking for somebody, they were willing to pay millions of dollars to some contractor who would sort this out, and nobody would touch it with a 10-foot pole. All this money just sitting there, and they couldn't figure out what to do with it because the record keeping over so many generations had been so bad and so corrupt.
But let me just say that in these transcripts, they asked the Attorney General, do you think Maine owes the Indians any money?
Yeah.
And because they had said, look, we pay them all this money, we buy things for them, this, that, and whatever. And the Attorney General said, yes, I believe we do. And the chair said, well, how much do you think we owe them? And Cowan, the Attorney General, said, well, I think we owe in the millions.
Yeah.
He said, not because we're not keeping good records now, but because back then, back in the 1800s and up to now, like 1930 or so, we were robbing the Indians left and right.
Yeah.
And that was the Attorney General talking in 1942.
Right.
Federal.
No, state.
State.
Wow. Any more questions online?
There's a hand raised.
Let me see, where's the hand raised?
Rena, if you wanna come off mute, maybe.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Donna. This
Good
is Rena.
Who? Oh, hi, Rena. This is
How
the
are you?
Body, Pleasant Point.
Hi, Rena.
Hi, Rena. You're watching, huh?
I do have a question and just a general outlook on the upcoming, November election. I appreciate the conversation, Donna, and of course, I appreciate all the history that you provided relating to this question that's going to be before, the Maine citizens in Maine when we go to vote in November. What is your expectation that this referendum question number 6 will pass in November? General outlook question, Donna.
Wow, you put me on the spot, Chief.
I am.
Well, right now, and these things can change at the very last minute, they can change. But right now, I think it looks good. I think that people in Maine are honest and they're truthful. And I think they want to do the right thing. So yeah, I think it's going to pass.
I appreciate your response, and I just want to recognize too all of the support that I've been witnessing with the citizens throughout the state of Maine relating to tribal issues and all of the bills that have been before the legislature in recent years. I think is a step in a forward direction, and I always appreciate listening to Donna, and we have side conversations as well. So I just want to jump on, raise that general question, general outlook question. Appreciate being with you guys this afternoon as well.
Well,
Thanks for
Rena.
joining. Yeah, great.
Appreciate it.
Anybody else?
I just want to comment about this description here. As far as I can tell with a quick scan, there's one sentence. One of these sections refers to Maine's tribal obligations that even mentions what's being referred to here or what's included here.
Yeah.
And how many people and voters in the state of Maine know what it's about.
Yeah.
That's why we're here today.
Well,
Tough
there is
way to
more
get to all the
information.
voters.
Yeah, well, like
It
that.
is.
There is more information available about it.
Oh, I'm sure if someone knows enough to
And,
vote.
well, I mean, the voters guide from the state.
I see, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, I wasn't assuming this was the only source.
That's
but-
just a very short summary.
Right.
I'll put a pitch out if I can.
Yeah.
That the Wabanaki Alliance is doing some organizing work around this question to get to raise awareness of this context. And they're doing like phone banking and canvassing. And there's a sign up online. We could include it in a post event email for anyone who's interested. But they are, I think, trying to, like what Donna was talking about today, like really provide the context of what this question is asking us.
Because you don't get this in school.
Well, and it's
Yeah.
part of what you're talking about. How can our people know our history if this
Well,
is
the only
not-
way you can do it is do your own research.
Yeah,
You know, that's how I figured things out.
Do you have a radio program on?
I do.
Reference?
Yes, I do. It's called Wabanaki Windows. It's on WERU.
I know, yeah, but on the specific thing
On question 3.
On the
Six.
specific, we can't. We can't.
Oh, you can't talk about.
We can't
do
We
politics.
can't do politics.
Well,
Uh,
Well, you can do political topics,
can
but you
talk
can't
about
do
history,
advocacy,
which is-
right? You can't advocate
okay.
on the
yeah,
radio,
I mean, what I've talked to you right now, it's history,
right?
so. But right now I'm just ending my series on ICE. Isolation, control, and elimination.
Yeah.
And it has to do with these transcripts. Every transcript that was heard in front of the Legislative Research Committee, there were 3, is read, and we talk about them. So if you're interested in actually hearing what was said in 1942, tune into Wabanaki Windows.
Second Tuesday of the month at 4 o'clock. Is that what you said?
No, fourth
Fourth Tuesday,
Tuesday.
fourth Tuesday.
Confusing
Thank
me
you.
now.
I know. We're the 4th Friday. I should be able to remember that.
Yeah.
4th Tuesday, 4 o'clock.
Well, thank you. so
Thank you,
much.
Ms. A round of applause. If anyone wants to stay on, we'll chat for a few minutes about the other questions. Feel free to drop off now if you want to. We will be doing our forum on question 3 and question 1 on Monday at 5:30. You can register for that Zoom only event. We'll spend a few minutes now on questions 2 and 4, 5, 7, and 8. If anybody wants to ask questions about those.
It seems like it's number 2 is really don't show yet. Right?
Question 2. So question 2, just a little bit of history. Oh, raised hand. You,
Maybe before we move on to 2.
okay? Wait, who's got their hand up? Is Rena's hand still up?
Hey,
Rena, is your hand still up?
Yes, it is. Can
Go
I
ahead.
just comment before I jump off? I just want to
Yeah.
say thank you to the League of Women's Voters of Maine for hosting Donna in providing this very informational session. Part of the discussion that I heard too, and I just want to mention that we have Passamaquoddy tribal citizen on this Zoom as well, Dwayne Toma, who serves as at our tribal museum, and he travels throughout the state doing talks and providing a lot of education and history as well. And there was a question relating to the doctrine of discovery, and I appreciate Donna's perspective on that. I just want to say that Dwayne does presentations on the doctrine of discovery, and I'm not sure who to connect him to about the possibility of having him speak to that. I just wanted to drop that in there before I take off for the day. But it was so good to be with you, Donna. It's always good to see you.
Okay,
Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much, Donna. I just wanted to jump in there, chime in real quick, if you don't mind. I just wanted to really thank you very much, Donna, for wonderful presentation. Explaining and articulating a lot of the treaties and a lot of the things that have happened in historical overview of the Wabanaki people. And I just wanted to really briefly talk about the doctrine of discovery, and maybe if we can get some of our state officials, some of the people in the legislation to be able to educate themselves on some of this, and maybe even some of the people of Maine to get to understand, some of the implications, and also how the doctrine of discovery paper bulls had a direct effect on Wabanaki territory and our homelands. I know I asked a couple of those questions, and you really was really articulate on really delivering that message And I think people are really don't know some of this information that we know, Donna, in regards to those decisions and how it directly affected our peoples. So I think it's real important for us to come together and work together to educate people in this area. So I really appreciate the time to talk about that at some point. And thank you so much again, Donna, and everybody else that put this together. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dwayne.
Thanks for coming on and thanks for your questions. All righty, you may,
I can leave now.
if you want to, you can hang out if you want to, either way. Okay, so I mean, should we open it up? We'll skip questions 1 and 3. We'll go to question 2 if anybody wants to just have a little quick one on question 2. You know, the
Well, I
back,
see no reason not to vote yes. I mean, I was looking for arguments against my position, but I don't.
our partners at MCCE have endorsed question 2. This is a money and politics question. It
Right.
has to do not with foreign ownership, but with foreign government ownership. And foreign government money coming in on the side, one side or the other of a ballot question. So the MCCE would be offering a yes vote. on
What's the
question 2.
MCEE?
Maine Citizens for Clean Elections
Or
Is it-
CCE?
is a close ally of the League of Women Voters. Yep. If you have any questions about question 2, I'll try to answer them.
Well, what's the arguments against it?
The arguments against it are, you know, these foreign government-owned companies have interest in Maine, they have interest in Maine business, and their voices should be heard. And they have a perspective which enriches the conversation and contributes
Okay.
to all the perspectives.
I got lots of money, yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
The other thing about that is, how much investment does Maine do in other states or countries'
Elections.
elections?
Yeah, good question.
Tip the tap.
You mean the Maine government?
Yeah.
The state of
The
Maine?
state of Maine or the US government.
The US government, I'm sure, has some influence.
It doesn't mean
You
they
think so?
can't say, it just means they can't pay large amounts of money to have that distinction.
Right,
I
okay,
mean,
so.
they could write an editorial, they could write a letter to the editor.
It's all about the money.
Right.
So
yeah.
I mean, it's not like we're cutting off their voice, we're just saying,
Yeah, they say.
please no more mailers.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
Something like light of it, but anyway.
All right, question 4 is the right to repair. This has been brought forward by primarily auto repair shops. Some other states have done right to repair that's a little bit broader, includes not only car repairs, but farm equipment and some other stuff. This one is pretty much limited to auto manufacturers. The auto manufacturers, I believe, are saying that we can't open up that technology because it has a lot of personal information about drivers, car owners, where they go, what they do, their habits. And they don't want that very personal information to get into the hands of just anybody. I can see from the other side that I'm not sure I want them to have
Well, I
that
don't want them to
information
have it
either.
either.
Why do they have all that?
But that, I mean, that's the argument that
Because
they're,
of computer
that's being
fixes
made
it.
against it,
You mean they are tracking us?
apparently.
Who
Well,
knows where I
I think
am?
that was one of the
That's a
interesting
new
things that
question.
revelation came out as a result of
Right.
some conversations. Because there's been now been conversation about what on earth are they tracking
Yeah, right.
and what are they doing with all of this data?
Well, they can use it
Theoretically,
for insurance
I
premiums.
mean, I understand the concept, but I'm just saying, I don't remember ever giving them the right.
That's right, they don't all know the right.
I think my understanding of the question is different.
That's why it's so tricky, Dave.
I think the BDN just had an article today, I believe, on this right to repair, so
Mhm.
it's.
Well, I mean, it's primarily the independent auto repair shops that are asking for it, and, you know, they're saying they can't stay in business
Oh,
unless,
right.
unless they have that.
Yeah, yeah.
So we can consider this as support for local small business.
I think it's-
One way to look at it.
I was just concerned with whether or not automakers would use that as an excuse to, I don't know, to refuse to sell to Maine.
No.
Maine is not the first state to be doing this, and some of the other states have, you know, gone much farther than us.
Massachusetts.
a much stronger one.
And there's been no issue that we know of about it.
Well, I don't think people are aware that the companies now are tracking our cars. I didn't know.
And having worked in domestic violence prevention, the idea of.
Well, there you go.
People
Right.
being able to track people, it makes me very nervous.
Right, the
Yeah.
privacy is violated. What privacy?
Well.
All right, that was question 4. Question 5 is a constitutional amendment regarding the timing of citizen initiative petitions.